I'm Dr. Alexandra Katehakis, Clinical Director of Center for Healthy Sex, and this is October 14th, and today's topic from Mirror of Intimacy is dating. So I want to thank all of you who are present for showing up today, and also to remind you that if you have any questions at all directly, our intake counselors are standing by and available to you at 310-843-9902. Also, anything that you write to me, any chats that you send are public. So if you want to ask a question anonymously, you can write those questions directly to a staff member here, Melisa at centerforhealthysex.com, and her email address just popped up in the chat box if you have that open. All right, so the quote today is from Nina Atwood, and she says, most of us don't stop to think about what to look for in the dating process. And yet the choice of who to go out with and continue dating is probably one of the most important decisions we'll ever make in our lives. She says it is also all too often one of the most unconscious choices made. And I would say that the neuroscience has definitely borne that out, that these choices that we make really are deeply unconscious because we're resonating with what we know. And when we resonate with what we know, that is a subcortical process, meaning it's not cortical, meaning it's not intellectual, that it's a visceral process, it's a feeling. And these decisions are made in microseconds below our conscious awareness because, again, we're seeking what we know and what we can tolerate in terms of our own capacity for intimacy and closeness. And that may sound a little bit odd, but time and time again, this bears out. So if, for example, a person comes from a violent household and maybe the violence is yelling and emotional abuse, they might say, I never want to be in a relationship with somebody like that again, and I'm not choosing someone like that, but inevitably they choose some version of that. Because that person's own capacity for intimacy was stunted by that emotional abuse, and therefore they can only get so close to another person. So somebody who was not emotionally violent, who really was available to them, is going to feel boring, or it's going to feel like they're cloying, or they're too needy, or they're not passionate, or some other excuse for why it won't work for them. So really, when you're dating, one of the first things you have to do is identify the common denominator in all your relationships, and that's typically you, or me in this case. That if we're having trouble at work, or if we've had jobs where they never go well and we're always blaming somebody else, at some point we have to look at ourselves and say, look, I'm the only common denominator here. And likewise with dating, if the person's never quite right, or, I'm always raising the bar, or my criteria is never quite met in some ways, then I have to start looking at how picky I'm really being and how much I'm really pushing away the possibility of intimacy because I'm so busy with my perfectionism or my fear or my control or whatever might be in my way. And you want to look at the traits that you're seeking in the people that you're dating. And have you actually made a list of the things that are important to you and really looked at what your non-negotiable items are so that you're paying close attention when you are on a date to see if that person meets that criteria or they don't meet that criteria? And what are the things that you give people a pass on? When are you being too rigid? When are you being too lenient? But what are you actually looking for? Because the real common factor in all of this, as I said again, is you. And so there are all these excitatory feelings we feel like when we're dating. And these are part of our expectations. We really often want the other person to be the one. People get tired of dating. It's a lot of human interaction and a lot of exhaustion trying to figure out what's right, what isn't, who I like, who I don't. And at some point there can be a real desire, even a desperation, to just say, okay, I'm just going to take somebody, I'm just going to pick something. But the problem about that is that we don't want our expectations to override who's actually in front of us. And from a very early age, we can develop specific ideas, as I was saying from the beginning, about what relationships actually look like, because it's what's modeled to us in our own families of origin. So some of us maybe experienced abandonment. On the other hand, some of us might have felt enmeshed with a parent and we just wanted to get away from them because it was just too much. So our experiences in our families of origin really color what we seek, and also what we fear in a mate. So building a relationship really requires self-awareness and self-understanding. It's crucial that you're sure of who you are and what you like and what you don't like, because if you don't know yourself intimately, then you can't really connect to another person authentically. And it takes a while, I think, to clarify all the debris of our family of origin, to really figure out, who am I authentically? What's really true for me, as opposed to what's been put upon me by way of my religion or my culture or my parents' expectations or what they want and need. You could be a 30-year-old female and you want to find a partner and find a child, but if your parents' expectations are that they wanted a grandchild, yesterday, and you haven't produced that yet, that can put a lot of pressure on a person to go find somebody just to have a baby. It can also put a pressure on somebody, if they aren't sure about their sexual orientation, but they feel like they have to declare one immediately, because their parents need them to in a certain way. And our 30s can be somewhat of a provisional adulthood, because we leave home typically in our 20s, go to school or get into a job or a career path, and start to make our own way. But in some ways, we stay very tightly tied to our families of origin. And it's really in our 30s that we start to deconstruct that more and more and more. And so to get a head start on that, it would be helpful if in your 20s and early 30s, you were really addressing these family of origin issues so that you weren't carrying them as a burden. Then even after therapy and even after you examine these matters, you might still feel completely aligned with your family, but at least you've chosen that. It isn't just de facto. And I think that's where some parents do well to not necessarily inculcate their children with particular beliefs, but they give them space to kind of figure out who they are, which makes for a more authentic person. So again, if you have any questions about this or thoughts while I'm talking, please type them into the chat box. I think all too often people start typing things furiously at the end of our time together, so I don't always get to your questions. But now would be a good time if you have a question. So as I was saying, this self-understanding, really what I call self-knowledge in Erotic Intelligence, my first book, really clearly talks about what is self-knowledge. It's really knowing who you are and being able to communicate that to another. And likewise, self-understanding helps us evaluate the people that we're dating. It lets us process and learn from what we're feeling in relation to them, either when we're with them or when we're away from them. And someone says, so what are some good assessment questions on a first date? And someone says, what are some good examples of non-negotiables? So those are somewhat similar, but you first have to have a list of what's really clear for you. So non-negotiables might be things like, if you have a particular religion, and that you're not going to give your religion up, that you want to share that with somebody, then you shouldn't date anybody who's not of your religion, period. It's just too impossible to negotiate those waters. So if you're starting out with a foundation where you already agree that your spiritual beliefs are the same, then you don't have to deal with that necessarily. Another non-negotiable might be that if you have a 4-year college education, that you want to be with someone who's also got a 4-year college education, because you're going to share similar ways of thinking, perhaps, or a language of experience of having gone to college. Maybe it has to do with sense of humor. that you have a particular sense of humor, and that you don't want to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't make you laugh or doesn't have a shared sense of humor. And people think different things are funny, and so not all things are funny to everybody. So these are the kind of resonant things that you're going to look at: intellect, sense of humor, religion, lifestyle, values. What do you actually value? There are people that value really kind of making money as they go along and spending it as they go along. So they automatically have a house they've got a big mortgage on, car payments. They're living a lifestyle that looks a certain way because they want it now. Whereas other people will say, you know what, I'm going to delay that gratification because my value system is really investment and saving. And I know in 10, 20 years from now, we'll be able to buy those things, but we won't have debt doing it. So that's a difference in values when it comes to money. And people argue about money. They argue about kids, and they argue about in-laws. So these value systems are the kind of questions you want to be asking, maybe not on the first date to take out a checklist, but you just want to be paying attention to, you know, what the person is interested. What kind of things do they like? How do they manage their finances without telling you how much money they have? What are their spiritual interests? And you can do this in a conversational way without it sounding like you've got a spreadsheet in front of you, by just saying, like, what kind of movies do you like to watch? You know, if somebody's really, really into horror films and you hate horror films, that probably goes in the yellow light bin, because you don't always have to go to horror films together. That person can watch those on their own. But when it comes to things like finances or spirituality, those are going to be bigger sticking points than the type of movies you like or the type of music that you like. So being curious about how that person handles those issues are the, quote, assessment questions on a first date. And then you've got to decide, again, what the non-negotiables are. You know, another non-negotiable might be appearance. If you're really into a particular look that someone has, you know, let's say you are female and you're 5'9", and you're just clear that you don't want to date men that are shorter than 5'9", for whatever your reasons are, then don't date guys that are shorter than you, period. You're always going to look for guys that are taller than you to go out with. That's a non-negotiable. And it doesn't mean that men that are shorter than you aren't nice or sexy or good lovers or smart or wealthy or anything like that. It just means that you're more comfortable with somebody taller than you. So that's another thing to look at. Someone says, is there a good book for working on family of issues in regards to dating? Well, working on your family of origin issues really have to do with, I think, pretty extensive look in your own personal therapy, so that you have someone else there that can ask you questions about it, who can challenge your own defenses, your rigidity, your biases, and ask you where those came from. Some of the best books on starting to look at those issues are, you know, John Bradshaw's books. One of them was called On the Family, and the other was called Healing the Shame That Binds You, so that you can look at what your family's issues were and what have been transferred to you. But ultimately, having a good therapist to talk to is super helpful in that regard. And then Jane writes, how do you handle family members that have not done the work on themselves and exude narcissistic and gaslight tendencies? Well, the only way to handle that, I think, is to do your own work, because when you do your own work, you don't buy into those things. You don't fall into the same pitfalls over and over again, because you're starting to set boundaries. You're starting to say no. You're starting to limit the time that you spend with people that are toxic. You're starting to not show up for events where you know they're going to be problematic. And when you start to set those boundaries because you no longer want to be a party to that, your relationship with those people will change, because they won't push on them any longer, or they'll know that you're not going to stand for whatever their shenanigans are. So it's really up to you. All of this comes back to how much work have we done on ourselves, and that's going to color our relationships with our family of origin and the people we pick to be in love relationships with. And Darren writes, do you have any recommendations for finding potential dating partners? I'm wary of dating sites. Well, I think the best recommendations is through friends. And if you don't have a big friend base or community base, you want to look at why you're isolating. But if you belong to any kind of community where you have friendships, whether that it is that you like to play poker or go bowling or you're hiking with a group of people every week, you start to talk to the people you know, or even your banker or your hairdresser, and say, hey, I'm really interested in dating. You know, I'm looking for someone who's age appropriate. Let's say I'm a white collar professional and I'm interested in only dating other white collar professionals or artists or, you know, you name it, or someone else that's also maybe, you know, works in a blue collar profession. If you do also, it's not about um, class so much as it is about what we have in common. So I want to be careful about those distinctions because they're sort of hard lines that I just made that are really reductive because it doesn't always work that way. I mean, we fall in love with who we fall in love with if we're compatible with them. So you're looking for compatibility. And if that person knows you well enough, then they have a sense of who you are and what you like and how you are in the world. And you know, then they are more apt to say, oh, yeah, I have a friend, or I met someone this weekend who has a friend that I think you might enjoy having coffee with. And you make a lot of coffee dates so that you can get to know people. And so that's the best way to do it. And then also to be willing to take risks when you're out and about in public, when you see somebody or you have an exchange with someone. Um, let's say you're walking your dog and that other dog get into a little bit of a snarl and you and the other dog walker work it out and you have maybe a little exchange about it. That would be a moment of saying, you know, I really appreciate how you handled this. Would you be interested in getting together for coffee? And that can go male or female. It's not a gender set thing. You can ask anybody you want if they want to go out with you. So do it in places in your life when you're out and about. Ask people that you know well, ask people that you know even as acquaintances, and see if you can get a network of people going to help you go out with people. And then Kaylin says, any advice for millennials dating in the era of heavy social media? Yeah, I think you've got to, you know, forget about the social media and do exactly what I'm talking about. You know, one of the things that I've read about is, you know, that millennials often are very freaked out about asking people out because they don't want to feel awkward. And I'm here to tell you that feeling awkward is a normal state of being. Whenever we put ourselves out there, whenever we ask a question about something, there's always an awkward feeling, but that goes with the territory of asking. So trying to circumvent feeling awkward will really have you sitting on the sidelines. You have to risk being uncomfortable in order to grow. You've got to risk hearing no from someone and not making it about you. You've got to have a thick skin and say, look, maybe that person's married, or maybe they're celibate, or maybe they're just, you know, wrong in some ways. And so I'm not going to take the no personally. At least you'll feel better at the end of the day that you took a risk, that you asked for what you wanted and needed. And if you ask enough times, eventually someone will say yes. And so just see if you can get past your discomfort the way you get past discomfort when you have to go on a job interview or do a million other things that we have to do in our lives that are not native to us, that feel uncomfortable, but we do them anyway. And Paul asks, can you suggest rules of thumb for how or when to re-enter the dating world after a divorce? Well, that's kind of a difficult question to answer because I'm sure that goes with a whole bunch of stuff. You know, how long have you been divorced? You know, what is the status of the relationship with the person that you divorced? Is it acrimonious? Are you friends? Is it going to be a problem in the new relationship? But if it isn't, then you have to start, I think, by doing the internal work first before you just throw yourself out there. And that would be by asking yourself, okay, what was good about this marriage and what was bad about the marriage and what were the reasons I left the marriage? Because you don't want to date someone or tolerate something in a new person that you didn't tolerate in the person you were married to. So you want to be able to say, oh, that person is picking their nails in a way that I hated, and that's why I got divorced. So I'm not going out with that person again because I didn't like that thing. And that's, again, kind of a superficial or silly thing, but that is that's the thing that you want to watch out for. So again, being clear about what are the green lights, what are the yellow lights, and what are the red lights before you start to go on a date, and maybe even making a dating plan for yourself. And so maybe the plan is that you're just going to go on a bunch of coffee dates and meet a bunch of different people to see what you feel like in relation to that person. Does that person feel easy to talk to? Do they bring out the best in you? Did you feel like you were relaxed and funny and able to talk about your political beliefs? And by the way, today, especially, political beliefs would be one of those non-negotiable issues. Because I don't think you want to be in a relationship with someone you're arguing politics with all the time, because that gets exhausting. And it can get downright contentious also. And so if you have a clear compass, then you can go out and have experiences with different people and say, which one of those people really lights me up the most? And what are their qualities that light me up? And I think I want to ask that person out again. So Iva says, after spending most of my life trying to connect in a relationship the way everyone else thought I should, heterosexual or to a lesser degree lesbian, at 60 I rapidly integrating into the queer community. It's been a real challenge to connect and date, especially since most people in my age group don't get, quote, outside the box relationships and dating. I'm also poly. While I'm checking out various websites, going to counseling, participating in things that interest me, I have no idea how to date in this world. Friend base doesn't really offer what I'm looking for. Well, first of all, I would say, congratulations to you for taking a huge risk and declaring yourself queer, and that you're just going to be in this community where it allows a space for your fluidity and to figure out what might be right for you based on the human being sitting in front of you. And so I can't really give you any feedback to that other than you have to just keep trying. I mean, it seems like it's just a numbers game at some point. And the more specific your preferences are and kink is and predilections are, the more it narrows the playing field, obviously. But I'm convinced with the millions and millions of people out there, there's someone out there for everyone. We just have to be grounded in who we are. And I would say to you also, Iva, you've got the opportunity to try out a lot of different things. Since you're willing to be flexible in your sexuality, to, put yourself out there and say, okay, I'm going to go out with this person and maybe have sex with them and see what that feels like, and if that works for me or if it doesn't. And if it doesn't, I move on to the next experience and then the next one until something clicks with somebody. Or you find a poly community that is inviting to you, where it feels like, oh, this is my tribe, this is where I belong. And then someone's asking, what's the best way to go about online dating? So I think I don't really have a whole lot of knowledge about online dating because, on full disclosure, I've never done it myself. But I think you have to vet the dating sites that look like they do the best job in screening people. I know there are some sites that are really scrupulous with questionnaires people have to fill out, because if you're really serious about meeting someone and not just hooking up, then you want to find the sites that really work to tailor people to other people. And I know eHarmony was one of the early ones to set up that kind of questionnaire and matchmaking process. I think there are new ones online, and I can't remember the name of one I've heard of recently, where they're really making a concerted effort to pair people according to what their interests are. So you have to do some research by Googling online dating services and then really vetting them, reading about them, contacting them, finding out what their rules are, and finding out how it goes. So do you have a suggestion of how long a love addict should commit to a love sobriety phase? I would say no, that's really between you and your sponsor, because that's too specific of a question. So it really depends on how much recovery you have, how much you're working a program, and how much you have gotten through the dissociative structures that make you a love addict to begin with. Because love addiction is dissociative. It's about obsession, which is really a fantasy pathway in the brain that keeps us out of reality, but it allows us to spin our expectations and our hopes and our dreams and our desires, but it doesn't really have you seeing the real person in front of you. And so you need a constant reality check about who this person is, what they say they're going to do, not your version of how you would like them to be. And that requires having sponsorship and people around you that are giving you a good reality check on that. And also you being honest about how much less inclined are you towards that kind of obsessive dissociation and fantasy, and how much more are you in reality. And then someone says here, in an era of constant options, how does one determine value? Well, I think you have to decide what your values are. And that's, again, these are inside jobs. These are inside questions. What do I value? I have a list of values in both erotic intelligence and in my workbook, Sexual Reflections, where I'm asking people to get clear about what their values are and then what their sexual values are and how those two things align. But you've got to be really clear about what that means for you. And when you decide what your personal value system is, then you know what's non-negotiable. And then when you meet with someone, you can determine whether they hold those same values that you have or not. Any advice for those dating and also dealing with anxious attachment? Well, yeah, I mean, you have to really manage your anxiety before you go on a date. And so that would mean asking yourself, what are my rituals for regulating myself before I go out with somebody? Are you meditating, journaling, praying, if that has any meaning to you? Do you call a friend who knows you're going on a date before you go, that helps regulate you, and then you also have a plan to call them when the date's over? Like, what are the structures that you put in place to manage your anxiety when you're actually on the date? So when you show up to the date, you're as grounded as you possibly can be, without feeling like you're just, super anxious, because that super anxiousness will come across to the other person. And it's perfectly okay to say to somebody, after you sit down and you order your drink or your food or whatever, and you're talking, just to say, I really want to be honest with you that I'm kind of nervous about sitting here with you. And I think nervous is a better word than anxiety when you're on a date, because who isn't nervous about a blind date or a new date or someone you've gone out with 2 or 3 times? I mean, when I was dating my husband in the beginning, I think on our 3rd date, we had plans to go to this really, fancy restaurant, and I just felt nervous and sick all day long. I was so anxious about it. So when he got there, I just told him that I was anxious, and he said, we don't have to do this. We can just go for a walk on the beach and go, have vegetarian food somewhere. And I was so relieved to take the formality out of that date. And that's exactly what happened. We just went for a walk on the beach. We got something really simple to eat, and we just talked and hung out together. And that brought my anxiety way down. So being honest about your nervousness is about being authentic and being transparent. And also not just blowing all that at the person, but doing everything you can before you meet with them to regulate some of it. Darren says, how soon would you recommend telling a dating partner that you're a sex addict? Well, I think that conversation comes certainly before you have sex. It's sort of in the same ballpark as the STI birth control conversation. It's also part of the consent conversation. And if you're all not having consent conversations before you have sex, then you're really not paying attention to what's going on in the world today. So let's talk about consent for a minute. Consent is an active conversation between 2 people where you have affirmative assent a yes to an agreement to be sexual with each other. And so if you're into a particular way of having sex, that you've got a particular kink, or you're interested in, something out of what is assumed to be, quote, normal, that's the time to talk about it and find out if that person's into it or not. And if they're not into it, you can't introduce it into the sexual play. And you've got to make sure that you're explicit about what the meaning is for both parties. So when you're talking about what's consensual, you're also, telling the person that you don't have an STI, or you do have an STI, and that you're tested regularly, but currently it's in remission, or you've had the problem taken care of, or whatever. You want to find out what that person's status also is, and then ask them if this is relevant, if the person's on birth control, and if not. And in any case, when you first have sex with someone you don't know, it's best to use a condom anyway. So if you're using condoms, you've talked about consent. I think at some point in that area, you've got to talk about your addictions, whether you're in recovery from drugs and alcohol, or sex, or gambling, or you name it, because the other person has a right to know who they're getting into a relationship with. And if they say that's fine or that's cool, it doesn't matter because, this is just casual sex for both of us, then it's fine. But if that person really likes you, let's say it's the 5th date and you've waited to have sex because you really want to get to know this person, and you feel like, wow, there are a bunch of green lights here. There are a couple things that are sort of funky, but I can live with. And now you're about to have sex, which really changes the dynamic of the relationship. It deepens it now. The person has a right to know who they're, making this deal with. So when we talk about self-understanding, as I was saying, when sex is introduced, it really, the neurochemical intensity really can distort our awareness, because it's hard to then make the distinction between attraction and desire and sex versus compatibility. Because when you're having sex with someone and it's hot, you're not thinking about compatibility. They might actually be a jerk, but they're really hot. And that becomes a problem when all of that starts to wear off, because compatibility is something that we discover over time with somebody. It's how we experience somebody day to day. It's whether the relationship is harmonious. Is it easy to get along with them? Because in the long term, relationships run on companionship and trust and honest communication more than anything else. And sex is certainly important, but it recedes into the middle ground or the background in a long-term committed relationship. So the companionship should be really at the top of your list. I remember once I was driving down the street and I saw a license plate, those little things that go around the license plates, and it said, "I married my best friend." And I thought, wow, that's so kind of interesting and cool and antithetical to what we think is sexy, but there's something really vital in that message. Does this person have your back? Do they feel like a best friend, somebody who's really going to take care of you? And are you really going to take care of them? Are you really going to ensure that they are safe and secure? Because that is really one of the functions of a long-term relationship, is secure functioning, a secure base. And that starts up front by being honest about whether you have herpes, or you're a sex addict, or you're in recovery from, alcoholism. All of that is just part of who you are. And if you are settled in it and solid in it, and you know that you are doing everything you can to make changes and be a decent human being, then that's what you have to offer. And it's got to be good enough. And if it's not good enough and the person says, not interested, then I would say, lucky you, because you dodged a bullet. You don't need to make excuses for yourself. And you've got to hold on to your dignity so that you can move forward with the next person. So you want to make sure when you're checking someone out and looking them over that you're not relying too heavily on your intellect and judging them and being too rigid about whether they're good enough, and nor do you want to be too heavily relying on chemistry and what feels good and that feels amazing, because both of those stances are going to be unbalanced. because nobody's that amazing and nobody's that imperfect. We're all imperfect ourselves. We're all difficult. They're sizing us up also. So this is going both ways. So you really want to make sure that you've got a fair and balanced look at somebody. So the best way I know to do that, to really make your assessment accurately, is to go slowly. There's no rush. There's no race. You can have sex for the rest of your lives together. It won't make a difference if you slow it way down and you start to listen to who this person is and get to know them. Then, when you decide to have sex, the attraction is there, but you've already determined that you're compatible with this person, that you actually like them. And so you want this to make sure that you're staying true to what your personal values are, and your goal is, if your goal is to get into a relationship. And so you don't want to squander the possibility with somebody because you're judging them too quickly, or you're just having sex endlessly because it's so hot, and then you wake up 3 months later and you're like, oh, I don't even like this person. That's a bad deal also for both of you. So, ask yourself what qualities you're looking for with somebody. And if you are only attracted to just one type, whether it's one age group, one race, one creed, one political affiliation, you might want to question yourself and do some writing about why the exclusivity. And I think it's important, even though if you're sure about the exclusivity, because you'll start to reveal yourself to yourself. And I think this is where most of us get into trouble, is that we just don't want to do the internal work. We want somebody to give us an answer, or a book to give us a checklist, or somebody to tell us what to do, instead of really grappling with ourselves and looking at our defenses and our judgments and our fears and why we think something won't work out. And to really know yourself is to give yourself and the other person a fair shot. Someone writes, if you introduce sex too quickly, what's the best way to have a conversation to pull back from the sexual attraction in order to be clear that you want more than just a sexual relationship? Sex too quickly in the dating process. Well, I think you're just honest about it. You say, you know what, sex was really fun with you, or whatever. Maybe it wasn't that great. Sometimes it's not that great the first time, which everybody knows. It actually gets better when you get to know somebody. But whatever happened, you want to be kind about it and say, look, I really had fun having sex with you. And what I realized is that I think I actually like you a lot. There are a lot of things I like about you, but I want to get to know you. And what I know about myself is that if I keep being sexual with you, I'm going to start to fall in love with you, and I don't really know you, and that's not fair for you. And so I really want to give us a chance to get to know each other and to take it a little bit more slowly. And now we know we're sexually compatible, so let's find out if we're compatible in other ways. And so, look, you might not say all of that, those are my words, but you can say your version of that. And the thing is, whenever you're 100% honest about what is going on with you, you can't lose by doing that. There's something endearing about it. You come across as authentic, like you're not playing games or trying to manipulate or seduce the person in a certain way. You're just saying, you know what, I think I had sex with you too soon because I'm really attracted to you. Oh, well. And since, so now we know that sex works, let's find out what else works. I'd really like to do this with you this weekend, or would you be up for whatever the next thing might be, because you want to find out if this person's really into whatever you're into. And the thing is, the person doesn't have to love what you love, but at least they don't hate it. So let's say you're saying, I want to go scuba diving this weekend. I would love for you to come with me. And the person's like, yeah, I'm not into going underwater. I like to swim, but I'm not into scuba diving. Or maybe they have an inner ear problem and they're never going to dive. And you could say to them, well, would you be interested in going with me for the trip for the day, like meeting the people I dive with and hanging out on the beach? And if the person says, yeah, I love the beach, I love the ocean, I want to go with you, then that's a green light. You can't hold them to being a scuba diver just because that's what you love. And that's a way of calibrating the companionship. If the person says, you know what, I hate the beach, I don't like getting sand on my feet, I never want to go on beach vacations, you want to seriously consider, if you're a scuba diver, if you're somebody who surfs and loves the ocean, that's going to be a no fit for you. That's a non-negotiable. And it doesn't matter how great the sex is or how smart or funny they are. If your world is at the beach and you're a beach person, you can't be involved with someone who's never going to accompany you to the beach. So these are some kind of broad ideas that I'm talking about here. So make 2 lists while you're at it. Make a list of all the things you want in a partner and everything you don't want in the partner. And then look at what the deal breakers are and look at what the deal makers are. So what are the things that are a resounding hell yes, and what are the things that are a hell no? And be really clear about that. And you might find that you don't have that many deal breakers, that you have far more things that you are lenient about and you're willing to go along with. And that and there may be even things that you just don't really even care about. But the things that you really care about, you should not compromise, because you'll end up resenting that person and hating them, and it won't be their fault, it'll be yours. And then look at whether or not you bail out of the dating process too early. I always advise people to go until they hit an absolute no. And there are some 12-step slogans. One of them is go until you know. And then the other is date them until you hate them. And so that might be a little extreme, that one. But it's about reminding us to abandon our perfectionism and to tolerate the imperfection of intimacy and the imperfection of humanity, and say, okay, I'm going to keep saying yes to this person until there's really a resounding no. There's a reason for me to say, this is not going to work for me. And I'm going to, get in as deep as I can. And here's the thing. Sometimes you don't know that for 2 or 3 months. That's why it's called dating. It's okay to break up with somebody after 3 months, because that's generally when you've got a read on someone. And there's no crime in that. That's the purpose of the process. All too often people feel like, well, I've gone out with them 5 times, 6 times, and now I feel obligated. And I want you to look at that obligation, because that's really your codependence. You're really caretaking to the other person as opposed to what's really true for me. So I think that gives you sort of an idea of how to think about the dating process too. So are there any other questions about this topic then? And I want to turn your attention also to a book that I've loved for many, many years. It's called If the Buddha Dated by Charlotte Castle. It's an older book, and it's kind of quirky, but it's not a book about rules or checklists. It's really about looking at these different areas of your life so you can start to distill down what your non-negotiables are, and to be honest with yourself about what really matters to you. What do you value? What are you looking for in another person? And then in that book, she also asks you, to write your own dating ad, to look at, well, what are you bringing to the party? What are the good qualities that you have? And to look at for yourself also, where am I too rigid? Where am I too picky? And does that also help stave off intimacy with the other person? Is that what keeps you isolated from ever partnering with someone because they're always not quite right enough for you? So I want to encourage you to think about dating as an internal process of really understanding yourself, understanding your values, getting to know you so that you can actually communicate that to the other person, because they have no way of knowing these things about you. And to be transparent all the way with your insecurities, your STIs, your nervousness, your anxiety, your divorce, and just saying, look, this is who I am, and not, getting into the unsavory details. It's not that. It's just about being a whole human being. So someone asks, is a lack of communication a red flag in a relationship? And I would ask you, what do you think? That's probably the number 1 red flag. So the fact that you're asking that question is something you might want to question in yourself. Why don't you know that? Because if you don't have communication in a relationship, you don't have anything. There's studies, a study just came out last year, which is kind of hilarious, that, people who have good communication have better sex. Duh. When you can talk about what you like and don't like sexually, you're going to have better sex. When you talk and don't and talk about, if you had an argument or what your upset is, and both parties can talk about what their part was in it, not blaming and shaming each other, but just saying, hey, I'm thinking about that argument we had yesterday, and I'm sorry because I was really stressed out, or I just gotten off the phone with my, mother, friend, whomever, and I was angry and I just let you have it with my anger. Then you've got a working relationship. But if you're just blaming the other person constantly, or they're blaming you, or worse yet, they stonewall you and they don't talk, that's not a relationship you want to be in. And you should not date that person. You should stop dating them immediately. And one of my old colleagues and friends used to say to people, when you're dating somebody 2-3 months, if you haven't had an argument, you need to pick a fight. And not over something huge, but pick a fight to see, how does this person fight? Do they fight fairly? Do they own their part in it? Or do they fight dirty? Are they a below the belt fighter? Do they spin it around and make it all about you? Or can they actually listen to you, hear what you have to say, and make adjustments accordingly and apologize? So few people today say, I'm sorry I hurt you, or I'm sorry I did that. But to really just own it so that you can move in closer with each other. Because one of the paradoxes of intimacy is that if you don't have constructive arguments to work through your issues, you cannot get closer to each other. People that just sweep things under the rug end up having really horrible resentments, terrible arguments, and they break up. It doesn't last. It's the people that are willing to speak the unspeakable, that are willing to say, you hurt my feelings, or I don't like that about you, or that made me angry. They're the people that work things through, that actually get closer to each other. And ironically, sex is better when you can have those kind of instructive and constructive arguments with each other. All right. Well, I hope this has been a helpful webinar for all of you. A reminder that our intake counselors are standing by at 310-843-9902. And I look forward to hearing your stories about dating. Feel free to email us and let us know how it's going. I really hope that all of you take to heart what I'm saying about working on yourself, taking care of yourself and what you need, and risking going out with lots of different people and having fun, finding out who you are in relationship to someone that makes you feel good about yourself, that makes you feel like you're mattered, that you wanted, that you're desired, and that you can return that to someone also. All right, so for now, I hope you have a good October. Happy Halloween, and may you all love well, and I'll see you in November. Thanks for watching. I'm Alex Katehakis, Clinical Director of the Center for Healthy Sex. Whether or not you're located in Los Angeles, you can join our mailing list to receive announcements about all of our upcoming events for professionals, including workshops, training programs, and our monthly CE lectures and webinars. You can also keep in touch with us via Instagram and Twitter at Alex Katehakis. Links are in the description below. Thanks again for watching.